Hello, my name is Roisin and welcome back to my channel. Before I begin, if you can hear people doing gardening work, I really apologise for that, but it's Bank Holiday Monday and I guess people want to get out into their garden. It's a very nice day, which kind of chimes with the theme of this video. Today I wanted to recommend you 10 books that to me just feel like springtime. So these are, I guess you could maybe call them cottagecore books, some of them at least. Others are a little bit dark cottagecore. I don't know if that's an actual thing, but the vibes that I get from these books are springtime vibes, whether that's because they are about coming of age or because there's some beautiful nature writing or what it is, but there's just something about these books that just reminds me of springtime. Without further ado, let's get into the books. So the first ones I'm going to mention are some classics that remind me of springtime, and the first one of those is Anne of Green Gables. Now, I know for a lot of people this is like an autumnal book, I think possibly because it's set in Prince Edward Island, famous for like foliage and things, and Anne's a redhead, potentially, so she looks more autumnal, but for me, I really think Anne of Green Gables reminds me of springtime. This is the story of a young orphan girl who is adopted by a brother and sister, Matthew and Marilla, and they wanted to adopt a boy, but they accidentally got sent a girl by the orphanage, and when she turns up, she's going to have to be sent back. But she is so hopeful that they decide to keep her for a little while, and eventually she ends up staying, and we see all of the scrapes that she gets herself into. She's a very imaginative, outgoing, enthusiastic child with a penchant for the romantic, and I think that's why probably it feels like a cottagecore kind of book. I think this one really feels like springtime for me because when they meet at the beginning of the book, Anne talks about sleeping in a tree that's full of blossoms, and I feel like though this book does go through a lot of different seasons, there's something about coming of age that does make me feel like springtime. It's all those new beginnings and all that sort of thing, I think really reminds me of the coming of age story in Anne of Green Gables. The story of the first book follows her from when she's quite young up until she just about to become an adult, and we see various different like episodes of her life, like when she accidentally gets her best friend drunk, and when she nearly drowns because she's reenacting some medieval poem about being sent down a river. I can't remember which one. I'm pretty sure it's Arthurian legend of some sort. But yeah, it's one of those books that's very bright and hopeful, and I think a lot of people, if you like Little Women or things like that, then I think you would get on with Anne of Green Gables. The second classic that reminds me of springtime is 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This one's a bit of a bizarre one. I'm not sure if anyone else would consider it springtimey, but there's something about this book that's so much like hope and joy in it, even though it's also very bizarre, and that I think just makes me think of springtime. So this is about the Buendia family, and it tells their life over several generations from when they travelled through the jungle in an unnamed South American country to found a town, and through their lives of their children, and the various different, mostly the men, but also the women, but yeah, we follow through their lives during war and during the introduction of free market capitalism. There's a lot of different like political things that are talked about in here, but for the most part it is about this family and the scrapes that they get themselves into by not being honest or open, and not talking about their past or their feelings. It's a strange book. It is sort of considered to be one of the like first major magical realist books, and I think that magical realism, there's at least one other book that kind of falls around this genre, and I think that sometimes that can be quite spring-like, especially when the magic is so related to nature, as I feel like it does come up in this book as well. If you've seen Encanto, it's kind of a Disney-fied version of this book, kind of based a little bit on this idea apparently. So it's very much a bright and warm and hopeful book, but there is darkness, there is violence and sexual violence in this book, so I would warn you about that if that is something that you need a warning for before you read a book. But mostly it's kind of the absurdity and the humour that gives this kind of bright and fresh feeling, as well as the description, which is very vivid and rich, and I think that that's what makes me think of kind of late spring, early summer kind of vibes with this book. The other classic that gives me spring vibes is Sense and Sensibility by Jane Austen. I think probably most Austen books are spring books, except Persuasion, I would say, is an autumnal book, but I think Sense and Sensibility is definitely the one that most feels like springtime for me. We follow the Dashwoods, who are a family who are the second family of a rich, wealthy man, and they have there are three daughters, and when the man passes away, the fortune goes to the son from his first marriage and they get nothing, and so they have to move to a smaller situation in Devon, and we follow them there. And as it's Jane Austen, obviously there is romance, obviously there is falling for the wrong man who is a rake and a blackguard, and there is running in the rain up a hill crying out his name. It's kind of a I've actually made a video about adaptations of Jane Austen, which I will leave linked in the cards above, and about how Sensibility is kind of a mocking of a romantic novel of that time period. There's a bit of satire there too about the ridiculousness of the romance, and the ridiculousness of sensibility as an idea, but but as with all Jane Austen, it has her signature wit, and also the relationships between the characters are very sincere, whilst it is also being kind of sarcastic and satirical about fiction of the time and people falling ill after being in the rain, kind of thing. I think that it's Jane Austen's earliest novel, and I think that that kind of juvenile feeling to it is also part of the reason that it feels spring-like. I feel like Marianne particularly is the youngest of Jane Austen's main characters, I think, and you can kind of feel that in it. She's 15 or 16, and so again we have that kind of coming of age and youthfulness and finding your place in the world that I think really makes me feel like springtime. I also have a couple of non-fiction books to talk to you about that feel spring-like to me, and the first one of these is Braiding Sweetgrass: Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge and the Teaching of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And Robin Wall Kimmerer is a botanist who is also a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and she lives in Syracuse, New York. And this is a book about climate change and about ecological damage and change and the ways that we interact with the world, and how to look after the world and the people, and live in harmony with nature, the way that Indigenous wisdom was more in harmony with nature than the way that we live now. And it's about extractivism and eco-racism as well. And there's lots of good information in here, but I think the reason that it reminds me of spring, not just because of all the beautiful nature writing, although there is that, there's a section in here that's written as she's walking through a like temperate rainforest in the Pacific Northwest whilst it is raining, and I thought that that was absolutely one of the most beautiful pieces of nature writing I'd ever read, and so that definitely gives those spring vibes. But it's also the kind of, whilst this is about ecological collapse in certain ways, it is also a book that has a lot of hope in it. There are practical ways to move forward. There are ways she talks about interacting with other people and the hope that she finds through people and collective work. It's a very slow moving book, which again I think for me feels quite spring-like, because things do sort of, you notice things very slowly changing over the course of spring, and there are sections that are very specific about like the plants and about clearing out a pond and the slow and repetitive work of it that I think really feels in harmony with nature and with the seasons at the moment. I think that nature writing probably is the non-fiction genre that feels to me most spring-like. And then the other book that I would recommend that is non-fiction is also nature writing about climate change, and that is Islands of Abandonment by Flynn. This is a work that is about places that have been abandoned by people and the way that nature can reclaim these areas, and that the way that leaving nature to act on its own is actually more effective than a lot of the ways that people work to restore areas that have been decimated. She talks about like slag heaps in Scotland and the way that nature has reclaimed them, and compares this to things like the High Line in New York, which had been a wild reclamation of a former train line that then became manicured and turned into a tourist destination, and it no longer had the wide range of plants and the native plants and the habitat for what was around. It became more sterile because of the involvement of people. It was a book that had lots of really interesting information and really wonderful settings, like an island off the north coast of Scotland where there's only cows and the cows were becoming wild again. I thought that that was wonderful, and the DMZ in Cyprus as well, and the reclamation of that, and also Chernobyl, places that you wouldn't necessarily think of as suitable for conservation really worked. She also talks about the dangers of conservation and the way that humans imagine the natural world as being based on the more recent past than what is actually natural. And again, it is a book that is about climate change, and a book that has a lot of facts, a lot of information that is like quite disheartening, but it also has a lot of hope. And I think that, you know, the regeneration of springtime is very much a hopeful time of the year. So I think that that really works for this time of year. And again, it's a wonderfully slow moving, really beautiful, really focused in on the detail kind of a book. And I think that slow moving books for me really work at this time of year, as I said. So then I also have 5 books that are not classics or non-fiction. They are fiction of from more recent times. So I'm going to talk to you through those ones as well. So the first one of those on my list is Beautiful World, Where Are You by Sally Rooney. Now, I enjoyed Normal People by Sally Rooney, and I haven't read Conversations with Friends, but I think Beautiful World, Where Are You is the one that feels the most spring-like for me. And I don't know if that's because I read it in the winter, so I don't think it's because of the time of the year that I read it. There's just something about this story of 2 friends who are writing emails to one another, who live, because they are living further apart, and they write about philosophy and politics and their ideas about their life and their time of the time they're living in, and the age that they are, that part of their life, and also the 2 men with whom they are both individually involved. One of whom is a best friend from childhood, and one of whom is a new man that she has met who they're emotionally stunted, say, but I would say that that's true of all 4 of these characters. And it's just, as a Sally Rooney book, it's very slow moving, and it's only really talking about the interaction between these characters. But it is a really interesting book that I think was trying to do a lot. I don't necessarily think it succeeded 100%, but it was definitely one that I still enjoyed. The Sally Rooney's writing, I think, is always lovely, and I like the way that she was playing with distance and perception. A lot of this book is about the way we perceive ourselves and the way we perceive other people, the conclusions we jump to about other people without actually taking on board the way that they are thinking, and the ways that by jumping to these conclusions we can miscommunicate so well. I mean, Sally Rooney does write miscommunication quite a lot, and I think that it is one thing that can get on people's nerves, but I don't think it's inauthentic or unreal to the characters. I think that the context as well of Ireland and Irish culture is important to this book, to understanding this book. And I think this book had more, although it did still deal with darker topics, had more lightness and ease to it than Normal People, and that makes it more suitable for this time of year. It was a very readable book for me, although not a lot happened, so if you need a plot I wouldn't necessarily say this one would work. But the ease of the writing and the lightness with which these darker topics are dealt with, I think works really well for this time of year. I also have a collection of short stories that I think are a bit darker than you would maybe necessarily consider for a springtime book, but for me there's something about them that feels very spring-like, and that is What Is Not Yours Is Not Yours by Helen Oyeyemi. There is a motif of flowers that continues throughout these books, so perhaps that throughout these stories, which is perhaps what makes me feel spring-like about it, but also it is a collection of stories that are kind of based on fairy tales, and like I was saying with the Gabriel Garcia Marquez, there is an element of magical realism in this book, a lot of weirdness and fairy tale style things that are brought into stories that are, some of them feel like they are set in that kind of folklore time that is not really any time but isn't modern, and some of them are much more set in our world, but overall I feel like there is, again, it does deal with darker topics and there are darker things that happen, but there is a lightness and humour throughout, and as well as some absolutely beautiful writing, and I think that makes it perfect for this time of year. There is a collection, there are a few different stories that are set in a world of puppets that is based on Pinocchio. There is a Little Red Riding Hood story, and there are various other stories, and it is some of the most beautiful writing that I have read in a long time. I really, really enjoyed this collection. It is in fact the collection that got me back into really loving short stories, or one of them. But there's a characters slip from the pages of their own stories only to surface in another. They are all interconnected. You'll find vanished libraries and locked gardens, lovers exchanging books and roses, and a city where all the clocks have stopped. So that kind of magical, light, funny nature of this book I think really lends itself to this time of year. vanished libraries and locked gardens, that kind of mystery and magic, I think is very springtime, very cottagecore, for me at least. Now a book with murder at the centre that for me feels like springtime, that is Crow Court by Andy Charman. This is about a murder of a choir master and the suicide of a young boy in a Dorset village in the early Victorian period, and this story follows the people who live in this village and the effects, the ramifications of this murder over the course of a few decades, slowly unravelling the mystery and the ways that all of these people have been involved. The different sections are told from a different perspective, and they are told in a slightly different style. So we have kind of a almost legalistic beginning that lays out where everybody was at the time, and then we have moments that talk about crows and the murder of crows following a person around that feels very gothic and dark. We have kind of a sea epic where someone is who has been accused, has fled and is on a ship. We have a kind of comedy of manners between some actors, and I think that Charman does a really good job of going through the different genres and writing them in different styles. It's a very witty and intelligent book, and I think that wit seems to be a theme here of books that feel like spring to me. All have a kind of lightness even when they are dealing with darker topics, and a kind of wit and humour that is a little wry and not quite on the nose or in your face, but kind of an undercurrent of this sidelong glances of amusement, kind of a smirk at the reader, and I think that that is true of Crow Court. I think that it is wonderfully evocative of the time period. Again, it talks about the politics and the class politics of the time, but it also manages to really vividly construct these characters in a way that it almost feels like a collection of, again, interconnected short stories, because we are told from so many different perspectives, but the narrative is the same. We are trying to find out what happened to this choir master, why and how and who done it, basically. And I think that it is a wonderful whodunit for the time of year, and again, lots of lovely nature descriptions and just descriptions of the landscape in general. So yeah, humour, nature, mystery, it's all very well done. Then another coming-of-age novel is Nervous Conditions by Tsitsi Dangerembga, and this tells the story of 13-year-old Tambudzai who embarks on her education after her brother dies. Because her brother dies, she's allowed to go to school, and she ends up moving further on in her education because she really wants to be educated. On her shoulders rest the economic hopes of her parents, siblings and extended family, and this is set in the 1960s in Zimbabwe, so it is set during that cultural context of a country coming of age after colonialism and gaining its independence, and the interactions between the white colonial people and the indigenous black people of Zimbabwe, but also gender and culture at the time, and it's a very, again, slow-moving, very focused on this one young, tenacious character and her grit and determination to get through. There is also humour here based on a lot of things of Tambudzai not kind of understanding what's going on, and you being able to read into that as the reader in a way that she can't quite grasp. Again, it is a bit darker than maybe someone else would consider for spring, but I think that you feel such a connection to Tambudzai, our main character, and you see her coming of age and her growing up, and I think that that's what makes this feel spring-like to me. It is less descriptive and less like flowery than some of the other books that I've talked about, but there is still something so compelling about the writing of this one. So yeah, I would really recommend it. And then the final book on my list is entirely different and I think a bit lighter than some of the other books on this list, and that is The Philosopher's Flight. Fantasy sci-fi, which is really not my genre at all, but I really enjoyed this one. It's set in the early 19th century in the States, and it is about these people who are sigillrists, which is basically witches, but it's kind of combining that kind of science and witchcraft together, and mostly sigillrists are women, but we follow this man who wants to become one himself and go to the sigillrist university, and he can fly and he wants to become a flyer, and this is at the beginning of the First World War, so that becomes part of the story as well, them getting involved with the First World War. And there are also a group of men who are really against sigillrists and women having this independence, violence. They want them back in the kitchen and not able to have any power, and so that kind of the acts of terrorism they commit and violence against these women is part of the story as well. I think I found this book so incredibly charming. Again, it's coming of age. I suppose it's a man becoming a young man becoming an adult man, and it's also one where all of the other characters, the side characters, are so very well developed, and they are mostly women, but they're really well written and really well individualized and developed. It's a book again that has a fair amount of humour and a lot of charm, and it really reminded me of one of those charming early 20th century novels, and I think that even if you don't normally read that kind of book, but you just want some sort of escapism, I think that this one works really well for that kind of a situation. It has that lightness, it has a group of people coming together, learning how to do something, and then going out into the world to save people, that kind of adventurous streak to it, which again I think can feel like this time of year, a time to get out and start doing things. And it's just, as I said, really, really charming and really, really lovely. So those are the 10 books that I wanted to talk to you about that remind me of springtime. Please do let me know in the comments down below, what are your favourite books that make you feel like spring is here? Books that you think are perfect to read at this time of year. I would love to hear from you. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and to subscribe. I put out new videos mostly twice a week, so I will see you again very soon. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.